Hi, in this session I want to show you how to paint stones, large stones, boulders, the large stones that you find in some fields, or the boulders which are found down by the seashore, not the pebbles on the beach but the large stones. These stones usually have a pattern, a texture covering the surface. And it is this pattern and texture which is interesting to paint with watercolour. There are many different techniques of painting this texture and different patterns on the stones. But the one I want to show you in this session is the one where I use salt. And again, there are many different types of salt you can use. But the one which I find works best for me is the ordinary fine table salt. Salt, when it falls on damp paper, absorbs the water, and if there is pigment in the water, then it also absorbs the pigment, leaving behind a particular pattern. And it is this pattern that you can use on your stones when you paint them. Well, I start by drawing some stones. I'm going to have a stone there, must get another one here. We'll have 3 stones standing in a field. At the bottom I would like to show that there is some grass, so I'm doing something like this, just a sort of no squiggles. This is the grass that the stones are standing in. If you don't show this, then it always looks like the stones are standing on top of the grass, but they're standing in between the grass straws. So this tells me that we're standing in a grass field or something. I also need a horizon somewhere. I'll use this a little bit later. So that is what I have to start with. Now I'm going to paint one stone at a time, because perhaps they'll have different colours, so it'll be much easier for you to see what's happening, because then I'll have to do the same thing 3 times and you can learn a little bit more each time. The next thing will be to decide which colour the stones will have, because I'm going to start with the stones. When I usually show this to my pupils, I start by painting them brown stones. And there are different ways of getting brown. I can use a colour, watercolour, which is brown, or one can mix brown colour from some other colours. And that's what I usually do. I usually mix it from, for example, do you remember this colour chart here? I pick out some colours from this area here, where I mix burnt sienna with ultramarine blue. Some of the stones can be brown, or others can be a little bit more bluish, depending on how much brown, burnt sienna and ultramarine blue there is in the mixture. There's also 2 different ways I can show you how I paint it onto the paper. I can start by mixing my colours on my palette and painting them on, or I can mix the colour on the paper. I'll show you that with the other stone. But the first stone, okay, I've got my water here, which I'm dipping my brush into, and then I take a little bit of burnt sienna first onto my palette here. Yeah, I wash out my brush here. Don't really have to, but I do. And now I take some ultramarine blue colour and I mix it in here. Then I go back to lit burnt sienna, depending on what colour I can see on my palette here. When I'm satisfied with this colour here, this is the colour to the first stone, then I go back to my drawing and I wet the first stone. I start at the top. Now it's a little bit difficult to see where I'm putting the water on, because the water is quite clean. I can just about see it, but I start at the top and work towards the grass. You'll see why in a minute. When I've dampened the first stone, I go back to my colour, which is mixed up here, and I start by putting it at the top of the stone. Okay? And you'll see what happens. The colour actually runs down by itself. And you can see what happens here, where I haven't dampened the grass straws, then the colour runs around the dry grass straws. And I can also make some other grass straws here. So now I've got a brown form, which is the stone, and I've got the grass growing in front of the stone here. What I do now is I take my salt. I've got my salt in this little glass here. I take a little bit of it and I sprinkle it on the stone. And if we zoom in, then you will see what is happening with the salt. The salt grains are becoming dark because they are absorbing the brown pigment. Now you have to let this salt stay on the damp paper until it dries. Or, well, you can also decide when you're going to stop it. You can also stop the process with a hairdryer. But, oh yes, I can just see the white areas are beginning to develop in the dark colour here, in the dark paint. And you can see how it's working here. And if I now decide that that is enough, I don't want any more development of this texture, then I can stop it with a hairdryer. Okay, so I take my hairdryer here. And you can see how the pattern of the texture develops on this moist bit of paper. The salt has to be brushed off when it is dry. And I think it's quite dry now, so I'll try and... yes, I think it is. Sometimes when you use a hairdryer, especially when it's quite hot, then the salt some burns into the paper, and it's quite difficult to remove, but you have to use a fingernail or something like that and then you get rid of it. This stone isn't finished yet. It's got to have a shadow and other things, so we're going to, but at the moment it looks like this. For the next stone, I will paint that with the wet and wet technique, which means that I'm going to put one colour onto part of the stone, and then another colour onto another part of the stone, and then mix the two colours together on the paper. So here, for the first stone, I have mixed my colour on the palette. I've mixed it on the palette here. But now I'm going to mix it on the paper, and it should give me a different effect. Whether it's better or not, it's up to the people who look at the thing. But I think it's a good idea to show both techniques. So I wash my brush out again, get a little bit rid of the water on my piece of tissue here. I'll go to my I take my burnt sienna colour here and paint it onto part of the stone here. Then I wash my brush out again, dab it onto a piece of tissue here so it's not too wet, go into my ultramarine colour and paint some ultramarine blue onto my stone. I can see perhaps there's a little bit too much blue here, so I'll also put a little bit of now this is a technique which which should be quite quick, because if this here dries under these lamps that I've got, then my efforts will be useless. So now I have put some more salt onto this area here, and I hope it was still wet enough to give me an effect. I'm a little bit skeptical, but I think I can see there is some movement of the pigments here. They are being absorbed, so there will be a little bit of a pattern. Again, I can stop the process with my hairdryer. At least just see if how much. Oh, there is a bit. See, it's important that you wait until the salt is completely dry, because otherwise you'll smudge it, and the effect will not be any good. So you've got to make sure that it's completely dry before you start brushing the salt off the paper. Well, I've got one more stone left, and what can I do with that? Well, I think with this one, I shall start with yellow ochre. A lot of stones contain yellow ochre in their colour, in the colouring. So, and then on top of this yellow ochre, I shall paint my brown colour again, just to see. You've got to, as soon as you start painting, you've got to decide where is the light coming from, and where are the shadows going to be. I've decided that the light is going to come from this direction here. So this area will be light, this area will be light, and this area will be light. Now you can see here I've already painted it. So how am I going to get it lighter here and here? But that we will see. But here I haven't painted anything on this yet. So I start by painting my yellow ochre over most of the stone here, but this area here, which is supposed to be the lightest, I'm not going to give it any colour. So I just wash my brush out and dampen it. Then I take my yellow ochre. I give it a little bit of water so it doesn't dry too quickly, and put it on the back of this stone here. And when I get to the front area of the stone, then I just dampen it a little bit so this sharp edge disappears. While it is still wet, I mix up my colour of the stone. I think I would like to have this stone a little bit bluish. There are some stones which are quite bluish, and I paint this colour on the back of this. I start where it should be darkest and come towards the light area here. Again, I don't paint it over the whole of the stone, because otherwise the whole of the stone will be dark. I want to have a light area here. So now with some water, I lighten the area around the front of the stone here. And again, without further ado, as they say, a little bit of salt about as much as you would use with your chips. Well, it depends how much salt you like, but not too much. The more salt you spread onto such an area as this, the more colour is going to disappear, because, as we said, salt absorbs pigment, and if you spread a lot of salt on it, then all the pigment disappears. So you've got to experiment a little bit and find out how much salt you've got to use for the effect you will want to get. Again, now I can get my hairdryer. Well, I think it's dry enough now, so I'm going to remove the salt, brush the salt away, and see how much. It hasn't been that much, but a little bit has caught a little bit. So there are my 3 stones. It's important that you remove all the salt for 2 reasons. If you don't remove the salt and you start painting on top, then it will affect the new layer of paint. The other reason is if you don't remove the salt and you frame your picture and hang it up in your room, and there's a little bit of dampness in the air, then the salt continues to work underneath your glass in the frame. So you've got to remove the whole of this so that it works properly. Okay, the next thing to do is to get a little bit of shadow on these stones. Okay, which color would I use for the shadow? Well, in watercolor, one uses quite often ultramarine blue color. So that is my ultramarine blue. See, my stones aren't going to be blue because there is a color underneath. And this color here is quite diluted. So it's only a very transparent layer of color I'm going to paint on this. And this light comes from this side here, so my shadow is going to be on the back of the stone, somewhere at the bottom here. I wash the color out of my paintbrush and just move it around a little bit, so this area here is in the dark. This stone is quite round, and you know it's a round stone because it gives a graduated shadow here. If it was a sharp stone, I'll try to see if I can make the next stone quite angular. See if you make a sharp shadow as here. And it's because the stone is quite angular. Okay, so it gives you it's like a corner. So that is a more angular stone. This is a more round stone. What about the last one here? We can also give that a little bit of shadow. Where it is darkest here you can see what happens when you make this very dark. Then, although this was dark before, it becomes lighter. It's this effect of light against dark, or dark against light. It's quite a well-known phenomenon in painting. If you want to make something lighter, so you put something darker by the side of it, and things become lighter. So there are my 3 stones. Now I need something. I've got to wait for the stones to dry, and when they are dry, I'm going to paint the rest of the landscape here. While I'm waiting for the stones to dry here, then I'll tell you a little bit about my eBook. You may be wondering if it's possible to get some sort of literature about watercolor techniques, perhaps literature that I have written. Well, I have written an eBook. It's called Watercolour, a Book of Watercolor Techniques. And it's available on the internet. The book contains 20 23 chapters, ranging from landscapes to seascapes. So it's water and land. It's a book designed mostly for people that are learning watercolour and would like to learn some new techniques. So it's a book full of techniques. You can go to my website, the address will come here in a minute, and have a look at what the different chapters contain. And if you decide you would like to buy the book, which doesn't cost very much, it's only about $15 US, then you can pay by PayPal. And as soon as I've got the money, as soon as it's been paid for, yeah, that's what you say, then then I will send it to you by email. Now back to the painting. Now this is dry, and the next thing to do is to paint the grass around the stones. Now I've got grass close to me here and grass quite a long way away. We know that grass is green, but there is a special effect which is known to people who paint. That is that colours which you can try and show close to you are darker, or well, perhaps not darker, but they're stronger in their own colour than the same colour which is further away. So this perhaps is 100 yards away or 200 yards away. This here, this is right underneath my feet. So even though it is the same colour, it's going to be a weak green colour here and a strong colour here. So when I paint it, I'm going to make sure that I get that effect here. And the reason why people use this effect in painting is because it is a very simple way of showing distance in a picture. Just to illustrate this quite easily, I shall use the same blue, but I shall use two different yellows to mix with that blue. I shall use ultramarine blue. In fact, I can show you how the two colours will look when I have mixed them. With one, for one of the greens, I shall use lemon yellow. So that's it's a dirty lemon yellow. It's almost the colour that I want for the grass in the distance. There was a little bit of ultramarine blue which went into this colour, so it's given me this colour here. Now the other colour I'm going to use is going to be cadmium yellow, which is much stronger yellow with ultramarine blue. You can see one is quite weak and the other one is quite strong. This is the one with the cadmium, this is the one with this yellow. I'll just give it a little bit more lemon yellow here, so I get it lighter than it was before. Okay. I start with the colour at the back, which is furthest away from me. I don't paint it on wetted paper, I paint it on dry paper, or that is because I want it to keep some white spaces in between some of the lines that I'm paint here. So I start with, okay, and then I paint it like this, and the same on this side here. I want to keep some of the white spaces in between the lines here. That's the white spaces show me that the grass is lying on the ground. It's not going up a hill or something like that. When I've done that, I need the dark colour. So I take my dark colour here and I paint it in the front here. Here, perhaps this is still perhaps this colour is still a little bit wet. It could be that they will run into each other. And when I come to here, you can see those grasses which I left as white. I don't paint them completely over with the green colour here. There will be a little bit of white remaining. So this will be the foreground here. And if you like, you can also throw a little bit of salt on that. I mean, that's... So you'll get some white flowers coming up here. Oh. Well, I need a sky now. I need a sky here. But with the sky, I will wet the paper first and paint my colour on afterwards. So, and the colour I want on my water is rather filthy here, so I think I shall change that. There you are, fresh water. So fresh that you can't even see it, but it's over here. Before I wet the sky here, I'm going to get my colour. So in this case I shall use ultramarine blue again for the sky. But what I'm going to do here is I'm going to wet the sky from the bottom, from the horizon upwards. And I'm going to paint it from the horizon upwards. That means that my blue colour will fade more and more towards the top of the picture. Okay, that is my... So that is my blue colour that I will use to paint onto my sky. But at the bottom, around here, I want some trees. And this is a very interesting little technique. Once my sky has been wetted and painted, then I very quickly will put some dark green colour onto the wet area at the bottom of the horizon here, and you will see some trees that will grow into the sky. That'll be fun. We'll see that in a minute. Okay. I start by water's dirty again. I start by wetting around my stones. The stones are dry, so I mean they won't start dissolving or anything like that. I mean, it needs quite a lot of water for them to start dissolving. And I just make a few stripes of wet up at the top of the sky. Then I take my blue colour here and I paint it mostly at the bottom, around my stones here. And when I've done that, you can see you've almost got some blue bushes at the bottom of this picture. This is what's going to happen when I paint the dark green at the bottom of my sky here in a minute. Okay. So now I take this green colour, make sure it's quite dark, and I just dip it onto the... You can see what's happening. I'm getting some bushes or trees or whatever you want to call them, and growing up. I can get a few behind the stones, perhaps. Don't need to have them all over the place, but something like that, all the way down to the bottom of the horizon here. And while the sky is still wet, then I'm going to get movement in this green colour, which is going to run up the sky and give me something which looks like trees, bushes, fir trees, something like that. So this is how to paint stones. I mean, the whole thing was about painting stones. Now I've also shown you how to paint grass and sky and some trees. But it gives a nice little painting, nice little watercolour, and you can see what's happening here. We've also got some white flowers on this bit of grass here. What do you think would happen if you first painted something yellow, let it dry completely, then painted green on top and sprinkled some salt? Perhaps you'd get some yellow flowers coming through. That is something which you can experiment with. But anyway, that was the lesson for today. After you have tried this picture several times and are satisfied with the results, then you can try another picture. You can try this one here. This one is a little bit more complicated, but the techniques are the same. The shape of the stones are different, but they are painted in the same way. So that was a session about using salt to get structure and texture onto stones. It's a fun technique, but remember, as with all techniques, it can work and perhaps sometimes it won't work. It all depends on how much water you've got on your paper, on the area that you're going to use your salt on, and how much salt you throw on. The more salt you throw on, the more colour disappears. So it's something you've got to practice, and in the end, perhaps it will work every time. I've been thinking about doing another session with you about the same sort of thing, about getting structure onto stones, but the next time I had thought of using art masking fluid. It's also a fun technique. You remember that painting should be fun, so continue painting and have fun. If there is anybody out there who would like some personal tuition from me, you can always contact me by email. The email will come here in a minute, and we can see if we can find out how we can get some tuition going on a one-to-one basis. But until then, have fun painting. Hi.